online workshop. Today is going to be an introduction to JSPsych, and I'll be one of your presenters. My name is Josh DeLay.
Could you stop for a second? You're not live just yet.
Thank you. Online workshop. Today is going to be an introduction to JSPsych, and I'll be one of your presenters. My name is Josh. I think we had a hiccup. We're getting used to this whole live streaming over YouTube thing, so bear with us while we figure this out. But I think we're ready now. Again, I'm Josh DeLay. I'm an assistant professor of cognitive science at Vassar College, and joining me today as my co-presenter is Becky Gilbert. So Becky, do you want to say hi?
Hi, sorry, I unmute myself. I'm Becky Gilbert. I'm a postdoc at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences unit at the University of Cambridge.
Great. Okay, let me navigate this. Okay, here we go. Things go so easy in practice, and then you go live with hundreds of people and everything breaks down. All right, so welcome to the workshop. And again, as I said before, we're going to be talking about JSPsych today. We're also going to be giving a quick overview of what the goals are. And before I do that, I just want to highlight that there are 3 other people who are not live on the call today, but will be helping us out in future sessions. So Josh Hartshorn, Connie Bainbridge, and Parker Robbins are all members of this team that are putting this workshop together. They'll be around today moderating the YouTube chat and helping us answer questions as they come up. We also like to give a quick thanks to the National Science Foundation, who quickly put together some funding to help us bring this workshop to you this summer. So the goal of this workshop is to provide a comprehensive overview of tools and methodological practices that are going to help you move research online. So today is really going to be a day about tools and how you use the technology of building an online experiment. But on day 2, which is a week from now, we are going to have a session that's not about tools at all. It's really about design, best practices, the issues of IRB that come up with online experiments. And then in day 3, 2 weeks from today, we'll be having another session about JSPsych, another session about tooling, and that'll cover some more advanced features of the library. And then finally on day 4, we're going to be coming back with a session on massive online experiments using the Pushkin framework. So this is a tool for collecting, sort of putting a laboratory online and collecting data from tens of thousands of volunteer subjects potentially. In addition to the live sessions that we're going to be having on Tuesdays from 1 to 3:30 Eastern Daylight Time, we also are going to have weekly Q&A sessions with everybody on the workshop team on Thursdays. These Q&A sessions are not going to be hosted as video calls. They're going to be through text on our discussion forums. We have 2 forums for this first week. So if you have general questions about online experiments that aren't specific to JSPsych or the content that we're covering today, we have a Google group forum set up for that. The link is here on the slide, but it's also available on our website and in the links below. And then if you have questions that are specific to JSPsych, there's a technical support forum for JSPsych that is available at that link that you see there as well. And we will, as a workshop team, will be available 1 to 5 to try to provide rapid answers to questions that get posted in that time frame or posted before that time frame every week for the duration of the workshop. For any information that goes by too quickly, the schedule, the recordings of these sessions, any resources that we mention, all of that will be available on our website, which is now movingresearchonline.info. And again, that's linked below as well. And finally, if you're watching this live on YouTube right now, and you're watching on a desktop computer and not a phone, to your right, there should be a live chat window. And this is where you can ask questions. And those questions will be relayed by our team to the person who's speaking. We do ask that what we'll try to do is address questions on the stream that are broadly relevant to a lot of people. If you have specific questions or things maybe aren't working quite right, if you're trying to follow along, those questions might be better saved for our 1 to 5 Thursday session, where we can provide more individualized attention. We do also recommend that there's sort of the idea with creating this workshop was to spread it out over the course of a month. And instead of packing it back to back to back, we wanted to give you some time to see these videos, maybe watch them again, have some hands-on time, and try out the technology, see where you get stuck, and then come back to us, and we can help you get unstuck and move the process along. So today's presentation is going to be, we're going to try to go at a pace where if you want to work along with us, that is possible. It may, we're going to have to adapt. We have a broad audience here. Some of you may be brand new to coding. Some of you may be experts in the technologies that we're talking about. So we're going to try to work at sort of the middle ground. And then hopefully, if you need to go back and watch the videos again at your own pace, that'll be obviously something that you can do, and you can come back and ask us questions along the way. Okay, so with that, I'm going to transition more to the specifics of the introduction to JSPsych, and I'm going to give a quick overview of the technology that goes into a web experiment that is different from, say, a lab experiment. So one thing that you might be wondering if you've never run an experiment online is what's different. You're used to running an experiment in the lab where you have a lot of control over the technology, and things are a little bit different online. So in the lab, for example, you might have a single participant who comes down and sits at the same computer that everybody else does that's working on your experiment. So you have the same hardware and software configuration for everyone that's taking part in the experiment. You also have an enormous flexibility of choices of programming languages. So you could choose to write your experiment in Python, or you could use a package like ePrime. You could use MATLAB, Psych Toolbox, things like that. And then also the whole experiment can be self-contained on a single computer. So the computer itself is collecting the data, and that data are stored on the computer, and you don't have to worry about any sort of translation of the data from the participant to you. In contrast, online, you're going to be having participants that are using a wide variety of combinations of hardware and software. So the hardware here being like different devices. So some people might be using phones, some people might be using laptops, some people might be using a Mac versus a Windows computer, for example. And then the software will also vary because people are going to be using different web browsers. So you'll have to confront the fact that some people are using Google Chrome and others are using Internet Explorer, and other people are using Safari. And again, in contrast to running an experiment in the lab where you have all this flexibility in terms of the programming languages, experiments online are almost always produced with some combination of the 3 core languages of the web. These are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I'm going to give a quick overview of those languages in a second. But even if you're writing, there are some recent packages, for example, that are allowing people to write experiments in Python, and we'll translate them to JavaScript. And this is something that like CyclePy can do now, which is great. But you're not writing an experiment in Python. Like Python is not the language that is being delivered to participants. You can use it, and then the CyclePy is doing some translation for you. So if you want to write an experiment in the native languages of the web, you need to be using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that'll give you the most flexibility that you could possibly have. And then finally, one major thing that's different is you need some kind of server to centralize data storage. So if your participants are completing an experiment on their device, you don't want the data stuck on their device. You want it to get back to you. So just to give a quick overview of this different dynamic between how an experiment works online, there are sort of 2 systems that are involved in an online experiment. There's the system that the participant is using, say a phone, and then there's some kind of computer system that the researcher is using to host the experiment. And this could be a box that's in your lab that's running some specialized software, or it could be something that's on the cloud, say using Amazon Web Services. But either way, a participant will eventually try to access your experiment. Say they go to Mechanical Turk and they click a link to go to your experiment. And that will generate a request on your server and say, hey, I'm trying to access the experiment. Can you send me the information I need to load this experiment? And the server will respond with the content of the experiment, which will then produce the experiment code will then be on the participant's device. And the participant will then be able to run that code on their device through a web browser to complete the experiment. And then when the participant is done with the experiment, they will send the data back to the server. And at that point, you'll have the data on your computer as opposed to the participant's computer, which is what we'd like. So when this code gets sent from the server to the participant's device, the thing that is being sent is usually a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And as I said before, these are the 3 core programming languages of the web. So HTML is a language that is primarily about the content. So what appears on the page, things like text, images, links, lists, etc., are all things that are specified with HTML. CSS is a second language that controls the appearance of those things. So how does that image render on the screen? Where is it placed on the screen? That's something that CSS would control. And then JavaScript gives you the interactivity. It allows you to basically manipulate the HTML and the CSS, to move those elements around, to change how they appear on the page, to add elements and delete elements, all in response to actions that are happening on the website, like a particular key being pressed or a particular button being clicked on. So just to give a quick example, and again, we're going to be diving into this today. So this is meant to be sort of a high-level overview in case you haven't seen these 3 languages before. If we're creating a really simple demo, we might have some HTML. So here's some code on the left that is HTML. And this is a paragraph. So it's got this sort of characteristic HTML style where we have these angular brackets and some kind of keyword here, P, that specifies what kind of element we're adding to the page. And then below that is an image element. So we're adding a particular logo to the page, here the JSPsych logo. And then what this might look like in the browser is shown on the right. So if I add some CSS to this, I can control something about the appearance. So here is some additional code that I've added. I've still got an HTML tag. I've got an HTML tag that says, here's some style information, which is what the CSS is. And then the thing that's in between the style tags is some code that's instructing how to display a paragraph on the page. So it's saying for every paragraph element, make it red and bold. And then this would cause the corresponding change that you're seeing on the right side. And then finally, if we added some JavaScript to this, we might get something like this. And don't worry about the code here in particular, but this is some JavaScript code that's adding a little bit of interactivity to the page. And what this JavaScript in particular is doing is it's saying, if you click on the image that's on the page, remove it, make it disappear. So if we click on this image, it disappears. OK, so from these 3 core technologies have been produced an enormously wide variety of software that is targeted at researchers for conducting their experiments online. And we're only going to be talking about 2 of them today. But I just want to highlight that there's this whole ecosystem that's been developed by a number of really dedicated scientists, developer, hybrid types like myself, who would like nothing more than for you to try out their software and use it to help you do better research. This may seem like an overwhelming number of choices, but one thing to keep in mind here is that there are different sort of purposes for each of these different kinds of things. So for example, these are tools that are primarily concerned with what the participant is seeing on their screen at the time. So it's controlling, like it's building the website that the participant is seeing that will look and behave like an experiment. You would expect it to behave in the lab. Others of these tools, and there's some overlap here because some of these tools do multiple things. Other tools are concerned with hosting your experiment. So the researcher side, how do you put together a web server that delivers experiments to participants and collects data and so on and so forth. And then some of these tools are also focused on recruiting participants. So how do you find people who are willing to participate in your study? How do you compensate them for doing that? And these are some tools that do that. I would say that the most important thing here is just to find a tool that kind of fits with the style that you're interested in working on. So you could try out a couple different tools and find one that you think gives you the right combination of flexibility and structure and the structure that works best for you. Many of these tools are in rapid development, so they're changing very quickly. So what features are relevant today, maybe all the tools will have them in 6 months from now. So today we're really going to focus on JSPsych, and on week 4 of this, we're going to be focusing on Pushkin, and these tools are really complementary to one another. So JSPsych is only concerned with what the participant sees on their device. So this is going to be the tool that allows us to put together an experiment that runs on a phone or on a desktop computer through a web browser. And then in week 4, we're going to be introducing Pushkin, which is concerned more with the researcher side of things. And this is to allow you to set up an online laboratory that's running off of a server. Okay, so with that, I'm going to switch over into a mode where I'm doing some more live coding. The one thing that you'll need if you want to follow along with us is that you'll need some kind of programming-friendly text editor. And we have some links to those on our website. And maybe some of the other members of the team could put some in the live chat. So I'm going to be using a program called Visual Studio Code. It looks like this. And the key thing here is that you really just need some kind of way of editing text documents that's not going to add extra stuff to that text document. You want it to be just what you type into the tool. So something as simple as like Notepad on a PC does work, although having one of these more fully featured text editors is really nice for a lot of reasons. So the VS Code is a free option, and there's many other options that we have posted on our website as well. Okay, so my goal for the next 30 to 40 minutes is to walk through the very basics of creating like your first JSPsych experiment. So I'm going to start by sort of thinking about how do we set up an experiment on a computer. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a folder that I need on my computer to hold that experiment. I've already done that. So I have a folder. It's on my desktop, and it's called Moving Research Online Tutorial, but it's completely empty. So this is where I'm going to be putting everything that I need to create this experiment. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to download JSPsych, and I'm going to put it inside this folder. So this is the JSPsych website. It's at jspsych.org. You can download from here. The fastest way is to start the sort of first tutorial, and it gives you a link right to the download section of the website. So here is the code for JSPsych is hosted on GitHub. So if you search JSPsych on Google, one of the first links is the link to the GitHub page. The latest release was version 6.1.0. And if you scroll down through the notes that accompany that release, there'll be this zip file here at the bottom. And this is the thing that you want to download. So I'm just going to click that. It's going to download, and I'm going to open it up. And I am going to move that here so you can see it. And I'm going to open that other folder. So on the left here is my folder that I created for this experiment. And on the right here is the contents of the download that I just did. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder here that I'm just going to call JSPsych. And then I'm going to move all of the files from the download into that folder. It's going to take a second because there are several files in the JSPsych library, which we'll be talking about today. And then once that's done, I'm going to close this window here, and I can just show you that in here is now the jspsych.js file and a few other folders, and we'll be talking about the contents of those folders throughout the workshop. Okay, now I'm going to switch over into my code editor, and the first thing I'm going to do is open up the folder that I just created. So I'm going to go here and select. So what this has done is it's given me sort of the folder view over here so I can see the different files that I'm working with. And I'm going to go ahead and create an HTML file, and this is going to be the file that is hosting the experiment. So I'm going to call this experiment.html. I'm going to make sure that it's in the sort of the root folder here. So if you look at this folder, so I should have experiment.html, and then I should have the JSPsych folder. And it's important that this structure is, if you're following along, it's important that this structure matches, that you have experiment.html and then a JSPsych folder. Okay, so now we have a blank HTML file. And I'm just going to start working through the sort of the basic structure of an HTML document. So one of the first things that is recommended to put at the top of an HTML document is something called the doc type. And this just tells the web browser what kind of document it's viewing. And it helps browsers render things more appropriately. So here we just have this sort of standard HTML syntax, which are these angle brackets, this doc type declaration, and HTML. And then I'm going to create an HTML document by creating these HTML tags. And I'm going to make the sort of two standard sections of a HTML document. There's a head and there's a body. And inside the head is where we can load files in that we need to use to create the rest of our code. So in this case, we need to load the JSPsych library into the document through the head section. So I'm going to use another HTML tag. This is called a script tag. And this is a tag that references an external JavaScript and pulls it into the page so that you can use it. So here I'm going to type script. src gives the location of the script. And that script is in my JSPsych folder that's in this experiment folder that I've created. And it's the jspsych.js file in that folder. I'm just going to fix my indentation here quick. OK. The second thing that we're going to need to load is what's called a JSPsych plugin file. So JSPsych, the way that it works is it has plugins, and each plugin defines a task that you might want somebody to complete in your experiment. So an example of a task might be present something on the screen and have the participant click a key on their keyboard to respond to that. That's a pretty generic task that could apply to pretty much any experiment that we could come up with. You could have some kind of situation where you want to present something on the screen and have participants click a key on the keyboard. So we're going to load the plugin file that allows us to run that task. So that's in this plugins folder in the JSPsych library. And that plugin happens to be called HTML keyboard response. So this is the full path to it. And if I'm going a little fast right now, this is meant to sort of give a high level overview of what it looks like to put together the first JSPsych experiment. And then we're going to do it all over again with a sort of a real experiment, a lexical decision experiment. And we're going to be reviewing everything that I'm talking about. So hopefully it'll gel by the end of the session. OK, let me make sure so you can see this. So I've got the script. I'm going to make this. Oh, I can't make that smaller. All right, we'll have to live with it. So I've got this plugin file and I've got the script. And then the last thing that I need in this head section of the document is the CSS file. So this is going to be the file that controls how things appear on the screen. What font am I using? Where are things positioned? And JSPsych comes with a CSS file that's meant to give you sort of a basic, not too busy design for your website that'll work for the kinds of things that we're doing when we produce cognitive experiments that are running online. So to load a CSS file, you unfortunately have to use a different kind of tag. It's called a link tag. And it uses a slightly different attribute to specify where it is. It uses the href attribute. And the CSS file is located in the CSS folder of JSPsych. And it's called jspsych.css. Oh, right. And you don't need a closing tag for a link. So you just can leave it like this. Yeah, HTML has a lot of quirks, unfortunately, but it's pretty forgiving. Like if I had happened to put a link tag in, it wouldn't have actually complained too much. OK, so now I've got the JSPsych library loaded. I've got the plugin that I'm going to use loaded. And I've got a CSS file that's going to control how the experiment is presented loaded. So what I need to do now is actually write some JavaScript that's going to produce this experiment. So I'm going to do that right in this document. I'm just going to create a script tag after my body. And I'm going to put my JavaScript right here.
Hey, Josh, can I interrupt for a second?
Please.
I think you're going to need a rel style sheet in the link.
Oh, yep. Thank you. Yep, I missed an important piece here, which is that you have to have this other attribute called rel that tells the website that this thing here is a style sheet. Otherwise, it won't interpret it as a style sheet. All right. OK, so in the script section is where we can start to put together our experiment. And here, we're not really going to put together an experiment. We're just going to sort of put together a message that appears on the screen and show you that it, even with just a simple message, it's going to collect some data from our interactions with that. So the way that we're going to do that is create a what's called an object in JavaScript. And if you're familiar with other programming languages, sometimes this is called a dictionary. So this is a a programming variable or a programming object that contains keys and values. So here I'm going to call this welcome. So the VAR is the keyword that says this is a variable. This is the name of my variable. It can be whatever I want. I'm going to call it welcome trial. And then these curly braces are the way that you declare an object. And inside those curly braces, I'm going to tell JSPsych that I want to use this HTML keyboard response as the thing to use to present this, this task to the participant. So I'm going to say type HTML keyboard response. And each plugin, and we'll show you some documentation about this in a little bit, each plugin has some parameters that you can adjust. So here, the parameter that we want to control is stimulus. And this is where we can type a message. So we can say, welcome to my experiment. And this is actually pretty much all we need to create a trial in JSPsych. We need to say what kind of plugin we're using for that trial. And we need to specify some number of parameters. And in this case, the minimum number of parameters to specify is just one. We just need to tell it what we're presenting on the screen. And then to run the experiment, once we have this trial, we have to type JSPsych.init. And this is what's called a function. So you have to, it's like a method that you're invoking that's going to do some other things. And when you do that, you have to use parentheses. And then inside those parentheses, we have to give JSPsych some options. And that's going to be declared through an object. So we're going to use these curly braces again. And then the option that we need to tell JSPsych is the order, the sequence of trials that we want it to run. So that's called the JSPsych timeline. So we use timeline and colon. And then we have to create a list of trials. And in JavaScript, when we create a list or an array, that uses these square brackets. So those are, this is what we'll do to create an empty list. And then we can type the name of the trial that we want inside that list. So this should be it. This should be the sort of bare bones JSPsych experiment in about 21 lines of HTML. So I'm going to save this file, and I'm going to open it up in a web browser. So one way you could do that is through a code editor. Let me show you another way, which would be to go to your folder, and probably your, if you double click on this, it should open up in a web browser. So we say, hey, welcome to my experiment. And it's centered on the screen. It's in a particular kind of font. It's a little bit bigger than normal text. These are all options that are specified by the CSS file that we loaded in at the start of the experiment. OK, let's do a little bit more. So just to show you that what plugins are doing is not just sort of showing things on the screen, but there's also data attached to a plugin. So I'm going to add another option here to my initialization of JSPsych. And this option is called onFinish. So what do we do when the experiment is complete? And because we're going to be giving it a list of commands to do, we need to specify this as a function. So we use the keyword function with the parentheses. And then we can specify a list of statements that we want the function to execute inside these curly braces. So curly braces are used in two different ways. One is to declare an object, and the other is to declare a function here. And what we want to do at the end of our experiment here is just use a helper function that JSPsych has called jspsych.data.displayData. And this will show us the data from the experiment on the screen. One quick gotcha that I should have probably mentioned more explicitly. Note that at the end of each line of one of these objects, after I have a name and a value, I have to have a comma that separates those. So here I have timeline, I have the value of the timeline, and then I have to have a comma right here, and that's important. That separates the different items in the list. OK, so I'm going to go back to my experiment. I'm going to refresh my page to do it again. And what this HTML keyboard response plugin does is it waits for a keyboard response. So I'm going to go ahead and press a key on my keyboard. And immediately, it's going to show me the data because the experiment ended. So what this is showing me is that it took me 9.2 2 seconds or so, 9,277 milliseconds to respond to that stimulus. It shows me what the stimulus was. It tells me which key I pressed on my keyboard. It tells me what trial it was in the experiment, what kind of plugin I used, how long the experiment had been going on, and some other stuff that's important for JSPsych to track internally. OK, I'm going to jump back to my experiment here. And now what I'd like to do is just to show you that this is nice. We've got like a simple sort of show some text and get a key press. There are actually, I think, almost 40 different plugins that are currently included with JSPsych. Plus, you can always write your own plugin. And there's lots of people who have created plugins who have shared them in the broader JSPsych community. So I want to show you some examples of other kinds of plugins that you might use. So in this JSPsych folder that I downloaded at the start of this tutorial, there was the JSPsych file, which we've been using, and there are the plugins. So here's a list of all of the plugins that are included. So there's plugins that deal with audio stimuli. There's plugins that deal with HTML stimuli, like the ones we've just been using. There's ones that are for images. There's some that handle different kinds of survey items that you might want to run, like getting a text-based response from a participant. There's plugins for video. And there's also plugins that are more specific. So one of the nice things about plugins, and I think what makes JSPsych a popular and very flexible system for designing experiments, is that a plugin can really be anything that you want it to be. It can be a sort of a generic thing that you use in lots of different experiments, like presenting text on the screen and having a participant hit a key. But it can also be something that's very specific to a particular kind of experimental paradigm. So for example, there is a JSPsych plugin here for running a visual search task using sort of the canonical circular visual search array. So let me show you what that looks like. So if we go back to the JSPsych folder and we click examples and we navigate there, there are a bunch of HTML documents, and these HTML documents demo different kinds of plugins that are available in the library. So I'll quickly demo maybe the visual search plugin here so you can see. So this is giving me some quick instructions. That's not actually part of the plugin. That's just part of the experiment that we put together that's a demo. So I'm supposed to press J if there's a backwards N and press F if there's no backwards N. So here is a simple visual search array where I should be pressing J to respond. And I think it's going to show, here's one with no odd image out, no target. And then here it's even going to show that you could have different kinds of images that appear. So the instructions no longer apply, but it's just sort of a demo to show that different things are possible. And just to quickly show what that plugin file looks like, I'm just going to open this up really quick. So you can open up these HTML files that are included with JSPsych, and you can see what the code looks like to run these experiments. So for example, here is the declaration for the first trial. It's very simple. I just have to specify a parameter that says whether or not the target is present. And I said, yes, the target's present here. And how many items are in the set. Here, 4 items are in the set. But then I can also do other things, like I can say there's no target present and also use different kinds of images for the foil. That's what's happening here. So to put together this experiment, it's pretty straightforward, where we can just specify a couple different parameters. And we can use these parameters in this visual search plugin, and we can run a visual search experiment here in under 60 lines of code. OK, let me hop back over into here. So let's add one more trial to our demo experiment here, just something to show how we might add a second trial to our experiment, and also how we might use a different kind of plugin. So I'm going to create, there's not really a purpose to this experiment, so it doesn't really matter what we do here. I'm going to create a trial where we show an image, and somebody has to press a button to continue. So I'm going to create that variable, that var keyword. I'm going to name my trial, and I'm going to use those the curly braces to specify an object. And then I have to specify the kind of trial that I want to run. So I'm going to do image button response. And we're going to be talking more in the second part of this tutorial about how you find the plugins that you would like for your particular experiment. And it's all on the JSPsych documentation. So here I've got an image button response plugin. I'm going to specify what my stimulus is. And in here, it's going to be an image file. So I need some kind of image file. JSPsych comes with some image files in this examples folder. So I'm just going to borrow one of those. So the path to my image is JSPsych examples. Let's see. We could use, I don't know, happy face one. That sounds nice. Happy face one.jpg. And the choices is a third parameter that I'm going to specify here. And this is the labels of the button. So because I can have multiple buttons, I have to specify a list of labels that I want those buttons to appear in. And I'm going to use that array notation. So it's a square brackets. I'm going to say my choices here are happy and sad. And we could imagine that the task is to identify the emotion on the face or something like that.
Hi, Josh, me again.
Yeah.
You're just missing the image subfolder in your file.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I should have said examples, image, happy face. All right. And then the last thing that I need to do here is to add this image button trial to my timeline to tell JSPsych that this is something that I want it to run. So I'm just going to copy this name here, and I'm going to go down here to my timeline. I'm going to add a comma, and I'm going to paste it directly in here. I'm going to save that, and I will go back to my experiment. I'm going to close that tab, and I'm going to reload this. So I still get the first trial, and when I press a key, it will continue to the second trial, or something will go wrong. So we were planning to talk about how to debug experiments. So maybe I'll go ahead and show you that right now. So in a browser, in any browser that you're using, there is a really useful tool. It's called the developer tools. And you can access that in Google Chrome by clicking the menu over here, going to more tools and clicking developer tools. And it's in a similar location in other browsers. OK, so what's nice about the developer tools is that one of the tabs up here is the console. And this shows you error messages that get created. So here it's telling me that I forgot to load a plugin for tiles of type image button response. So let me go back to my code. So one of the things that you need to do whenever you use a different kind of plugin is you need to load that plugin into the page. So I'm going to copy this other plugin, and I'm just going to change HTML keyboard response to image button response and save that. And then I'm going to go back, and I'm going to refresh. Oh, I've got a breakpoint in for some reason. Let me actually close this for now. OK, so now we get a face on the screen, and we can identify the emotion by clicking one of the two buttons. And I'll just click happy. And here we can see the data. So now there are two trials. And so here's trial 1, and here's trial 2. You can see my response time, what stimulus was on the screen, and what button I pressed, and so on and so forth. Note that different plugins record different kinds of data. So for example, the button response plugin has a data type for button pressed, whereas the keyboard response plugin has a button for key press, or sorry, a data type for key press. OK, how are we doing on time here? Pretty good. So I think I want to show one more quick thing here, which is that you can construct a set of trials in JSPsych using any of the normal things that you would use in JavaScript. So JSPsych is just kind of like a lightweight wrapper that gives you some extra functionality for JavaScript, but all the normal things that you can do in a programming language are still available to you when you're using JSPsych. So this is going to be, if you're brand new to programming, I apologize, this is not going to be the most useful demonstration for you right now, but I just want to highlight that one of the ways that we could put together an experiment would be to use something like a loop to create a bunch of trials more efficiently. So I'm going to go ahead and declare an empty list up here for my timeline. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a list of words that I want to present. So I'm going to do welcome to my experiment. And now what I'm going to do is write a loop that adds these trials to my timeline one by one. So I'm going to do, I'm going to create what's called a for loop. Again, this is kind of a little bit out of bounds of what we're going to talk about in terms of explaining some of the basic programming here. But what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to sort of iterate through a list and add trials for each item on the list. So we're going to do I less than words.length, I plus plus. So what this statement is saying is basically go through every element on this list. And what I'm going to do is add a trial to my experiment for every word that appears here. So I'm going to maybe copy this up here. And instead of having my stimulus be welcome to my experiment, I'm going to make the experiment an item that's in this array that I've created. And the way that we do that in JavaScript is with the brackets, and we can use the I as the index here. And then the last thing that I need to do here is add this trial that I've just created to my timeline that I've generated up here. So I'm going to say timeline dot push. And what this does is it takes the thing that's in here, the welcome trial, and it adds it on to the end of the timeline. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to create 4 trials. I'm going to create a trial that displays the word welcome, a trial that displays the word to, my, and experiment. And that's being done very efficiently here. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to replace this timeline down here with the variable that I created up here. So I created a timeline, I've added things to that timeline here, and now I'm telling JSPsych to use that object that I named timeline as the timeline parameter. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And I would like to open that up. So we get the word welcome to my experiment. And what's cool about this is if you're, say, a language researcher, we've essentially just created a self-paced reading experiment with that particular technique. In fact, if we go, we can see here are the reaction times for each of the words that appeared on the screen. So we've taken our hello world kind of experiment and made it a little bit more like an experiment that you might want to run in an actual setting. Okay, let me finish up here by talking about how do you fix things when something's gone wrong here? How do you diagnose an error that you've made? So we saw a little bit of that when I accidentally made an error earlier, but let me show some more examples of what might happen when you make an error. So I'm going to go ahead and add some errors to my code. I'm going to pretend that maybe I misspelled the library up here. So I'm going to delete that last H. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to go back to my browser. And I'm going to refresh. And nothing happens on the screen. So again, this is the kind of situation where if nothing's happening, you're expecting something to happen, it's time to open up those developer tools. So you go to the developer tools. And here, it doesn't look like I immediately have an error, but that's because over here, I've got this tab for no user messages. If I click on errors, you can see that there are 4 errors, or up here, you can see that there's this red X with the 4. And what this is saying is the first error message is usually the root of all the problems. So we've got a file not found error. It's saying that this file right here doesn't exist. And if I looked carefully, I would notice that I've misspelled the JSPsych file. So I can fix that. Okay, I've already shown you what happens if you forget to load a plugin, because I forgot to load a plugin. What else were we gonna demo here? Let me check my notes really quick. Okay, so what if I misspelled the name of the plugin right here? That's something that might happen. So again, I'll just delete the last character. I've got HTML keyboard response without the E, and I'll save that. Let me jump back over into the browser and refresh. So the warning message I get is actually the same message that I get if I forget to load a plugin. It says no plugin loaded for trials of type HTML keyboard response. But here the thing to note is that that's spelled incorrectly. So it's saying it's looking for a plugin with that name, but that doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because I spelled it incorrectly. And then there's some downstream errors that happen because it can't actually run the trials and it's missing stuff. So we can go fix that one. What about that other, the thing that I mentioned earlier, that commas are really important. So what if I forgot the comma down here after timeline? So I did timeline, colon, timeline, no comma, and then I tried to declare this on finish. Well, one of the nice things about having a text editor that's designed for programming, like Visual Studio Code, is that it'll actually sometimes tell you that there are errors missing, like right in the text as you're editing. So here it's underlining this like I made a like a spelling mistake in a word processor, but instead it's a code problem. It's saying that there's a comma expected. So that comma should have gone here. But let me show you what that looks like in the browser in case your text editor doesn't show you this kind of warning message. So I'm going to go back here and I get it, nothing loads again. And I get an error in the developer console that says uncaught syntax error, unexpected identifier. That message may be a little opaque if you're new to programming. But the really nice thing is that you can click on this link right here, and it will actually open up your code, and it'll show you the line that caused the problem. And now here, it looks like the line that caused the problem is line 26, but actually the mistake is on the line before, and this line is causing a problem because it doesn't understand that this should be a new statement. It's expecting the comma. So whenever you see an error like this, it's good to look sort of before and on the line itself to figure out where the source of that error might be. So I'm going to go ahead and put that comma back in to fix that error. And I think that's kind of the main gist of how to use the debugger. There's, of course, lots of different kinds of errors that you might make, but this is a fairly straightforward experiment. So it's not, there's not a lot of different things that we could do wrong here. The one thing that I will show you very quickly is that if you're used to programming languages where you use things like print statements or writing out some text file, then this is a good way. One way you can do that in JavaScript is you can type console.log, which is a special command, and you can put a message here. So that message can be whatever you want. I'm going to save this. I'm going to open this back up. And what you'll see over here in the developer tools, let me get back to just the console. It's not an error, so it's not going to show up in the error tab, but it does show up in the user messages tab right here. And it says, oh, there's my code wrote a message out. So this is one way that you can do some debugging. You could do print statements. But actually, the debugger for JavaScript is really nice. Like the browsers do a really, really nice job of providing a lot of different ways to debug. So another way to debug is to not rely on print statements at all. You can actually go into the code itself by clicking the Sources tab. And here you can see the code. And you can actually stop the code executing at different moments. So I'm going to put what's called a breakpoint, or a point where I want the code to sort of pause by clicking on the line number. So you see this red circle appears. And what will happen is that the code will execute up to this point, and then it will pause. And so you get this message over here that says paused in debugger. And the debugger is highlighting the line that I just paused on. And what's really nice about this is that you can actually do things like hover over a variable in the code to see what that variable contains. So for example, I can see that my timeline right now, after going through that for loop, has 4 items on it. It's got item 0, 1, 2, and 3. And I can even see like what the stimulus item is for each of those items on the timeline. So this is a really nice way to do some debugging without having to type out print statements, is you just put a breakpoint at the right spot in your code, and then you can highlight over the text to see what's there. I'll go ahead and click continue now. We can run through the experiment again, and we see the data from that experiment one more time.
Hey, Josh, we have a question that I think you could probably answer at this point.
Okay.
So this is about our self-paced reading experiment that we have here. So going back to this little experiment, The question is, now that we have this experiment, can we keep track of the response times? And if not, how would we add code to do that?
Yes, so the response times are being kept track of. And they're being kept track of because the plugin file that we're using, the HTML keyboard response plugin, records response times as part of its design. So anytime you use that plugin, you're automatically recording response times. So just to show you, since we happen to have the data up here, this first item here is the response time for the first trial. And then here's the response time for the second and the third and the fourth. And obviously, I was just pressing keys very quickly. So these are unreasonably fast, but those are the response times that we're measuring here. And different plugins will record different kinds of data. So if you're using that visual search plugin, for example, it would record things like whether the participant correctly identified that there was a target or not in the plugin or in the trial. Okay, I think that's close to the end of our intro, where we're going to be talking about just sort of creating this, very basic, not really an experiment, but kind of a demo of how to set up a JSPsych experiment. And then in a minute, Becky will take over, and she's going to walk through creating a lexical decision task from start to finish. And she'll be reviewing a lot of the things that I talked about, and also elaborating on some stuff and showing you more of the documentation and giving you more of an idea about how you might approach designing an experiment from scratch in JSPsych when you've actually got a real experiment in mind as opposed to just a demonstration. So I think what our plan right now is to take a few minutes to let people get up and do other things for a moment if they need to. So we'll resume the live coding in about 5 minutes. And while we're doing that, if there are any questions, Becky and I will be available to answer questions for the next 5 minutes. So we'll get going again in 5 minutes with the lexical decision task. And in the meantime, please post any questions you've got in the live chat. Okay, I see we're getting a question about what kinds of plugins are available. So let me show you where you can find that information. So on the JSPsych website, there's a lot of documentation. There's some tutorials, but there's this menu option here for plugins. And this lists out all of the different plugins that are available in JSPsych. These are only the plugins that are included with the main JSPsych distribution. There are also people who have published plugins that are sort of their own experiment. It's a nice way to share experiment code, is you write a plugin for your experiment and then you can share it with other people to do the task that you've designed. But one thing you can do here is just scroll through, and the names are pretty descriptive about what kinds of things you might want to do. The other thing you can do is click this overview page right here. This gives you a little bit of information about how to use a plugin and some parameters and what data is collected, but it also gives you a list with a short description of what that plugin does. So you can scroll through this list to see what every plugin does. So for example, here's the description from the visual search plugin that I showed earlier. Another place that you would also be able to see this, which I showed earlier, is when you download JSPsych, it does come with all the plugin files. So you can of course just kind of scroll through the folder and see what the plugin files are. You can also go through that examples folder, and you can just, if you see one that says, oh, this sounds interesting, what does it look like if I do an RDK? What's an RDK? Well, it's actually one of these random dot kinematogram kinds of things. And it records a lot of data for every trial. So just to show you that different plugins do record a wide variety of different kinds of data. If you have a task that doesn't exist as a plugin yet, you can of course create your own plugin. That's one of the sort of the powerful features of JSPsych, is that the template for designing a plugin is as flexible as we could possibly make it. You can really do anything that you could do online. You can turn into a JSPsych plugin. My lab sometimes makes literally video games that people play on their phones, and sometimes we make those as JSPsych plugins. So there's a tutorial page here in the documentation for how to create a plugin file, and this is the sort of bare bones template for a plugin. And this page in the documentation sort of walks through what you need to do. But if you can program a task to run on a web browser, you can turn it into a JSPsych plugin. And the advantage of doing that, the advantage of turning it into a plugin, is that it does give you sort of a standardized interface to that task. So if you know that there's a task that you're going to be using, and the things that vary in that task are easily definable as a couple of parameters, then it might make a lot of sense to encapsulate that task as a plugin. And it'll save you a lot of time when you use it in an experiment to be able to just quickly modify the parameters and then reuse that code that you've written to actually run that basic task. Okay, any other questions that we should get to? I don't actually have the question stream open. I can't, so I'm relying on our team to relay things in. But if there's nothing else, I think we'll resume in about 1 minute.
Yeah, I can see a few more JSPsych related questions, but I'm wondering if we should save those for the end since we're just about to start, I think.
Okay. Nothing that's quick to get to?
Somebody's asked about the difference between response time and the time elapsed in the data.
Okay. So time elapsed, I happen to have this data up still. You can see that they're very close here. So time elapsed is measured at the end of the trial. And response time is, as best as we can, measured from the onset of the stimulus. So sometimes there's a few milliseconds of operations that have to happen in between trials. And time elapsed is also cumulative. So this records the time from the start of the experiment. So here they're very similar, but as you get to the end of the experiment, you can see that it's cumulative and it's nowhere close to the response time. Okay, so with that, I think we'll switch over into the lexical decision task, and I'll turn it over to Becky.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to share my screen here. Okay, so you should be seeing the JSPsych web page. Is that right, Josh?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. And just give me a second to get my editor here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is actually go through building a lexical decision experiment. So hopefully what this will do is just get you used to building something that's a little bit more like a real experiment. So I've got my text editor open here, and I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to save this right away as an HTML file. Now I've created a folder for this experiment called lexical decision, and inside of this is my JSPsych folder. It doesn't really matter where you put this as long as you have that JSPsych folder in the same directory. So I'll call this lexical decision.html. And then at this point, what we could do is just copy over everything from our Hello World demo to give us all that kind of boilerplate setup stuff. But I think it would be a good idea just to type it back in so that we can just kind of go through it again and make sure we're familiar with it. So we have this doc type HTML declaration, and then let's do our HTML tags. And then inside this, we're going to create these 3 different sections. We have head, and that's where we're going to load in the files we need. We'll create the body section, and we're just going to leave that empty. And finally, we'll create a script section down here. And this is where we're going to write in our JavaScript to actually set up the task and run it. So if we go back to our head section, let's actually give our page a title. So we're going to use this title tag here. And this is going to be the text that appears in the browser tab itself on the top. So let's I'll write in lexical decision. Spell it right, decision. And now we know we're going to need the core JSPsych library, so we can load that in with a script tag. So again, this is script and then src equals, and then in quotes, we need our JSPsych folder. and then the JSPsych.js file. So we can close that. And then at this point, I would load in any plugins that we're going to use. And we haven't talked about which plugins we're going to use yet, but I'm pretty sure we'll use the HTML keyboard response plugin again. So let's go and add in that. So if we go into the folder again, then in the plugin subfolder, and then all of these plugins start with JSPsych and then HTML keyboard response. Turn off my order up here. Okay. Finally, what I'm going to add in here is the default CSS file, which is going to give us our formatting. So let's do link and then href equals, and then the path to that, which is in the CSS subfolder, and it's called JSPsych.css. And then we'll write in here rel equals style sheet. Okay, so now we can start building our experiment down here in the script. And I'm going to set this up the same way that Josh did before, where I'm going to create a timeline array. And I'm just going to initialize that as an empty array, and then we're going to add things to it as we go along. And then what I can do is start building, let's say, a word trial. So what I like to do is start really simple and just kind of build things up slowly. So the very first thing we're going to do is just try to get some text on the screen. So we could call it word trial. This is going to be an object. So this is very much like our Hello World demo at this point. And we can just use this HTML keyboard response plugin. Now, if we weren't sure which plugin to use, what I would do then is go into the documentation. Let me find that here. So I would go into this plugin section, and this is just a nice way to remind yourself what plugins are already available. And you can just kind of have a look down and say, okay, so we know we need to put some text on the screen. So HTML is probably a good choice for the stimulus. And then because this is a speeded task, let's also use the keyboard response. So we can select that plugin, and then if we get the documentation up, we can remind ourselves of what the parameters are that it needs, and then what kind of data those parameters are expecting to get, and so on. And I should probably stop to say, if you're not familiar with the lexical decision task, what we're trying to do here is get some strings of characters on the screen, so just some text. And then the participant's task is to say whether or not that is a word. So that's what we're going to have people do. So for this trial, we'll give it type HTML keyboard response. And we can give it a stimulus. And just as a placeholder, let's go with a word like apple. And then I'll refer back to our documentation. So because this is a keyboard response plugin, we need to give it some key choices. By default, it says here that it will listen for all keys. So you don't have to type out every key on the keyboard if you want to do it that way. We can give it an array that contains the keys that are considered valid responses that we're listening for. So we'll do that. And we need, right in choices here as an array, we're going to need 2 keys, one to indicate a word and one to indicate non-word. So I'm going to go with F and J. Then I'll go back here and look at the other parameters for this plugin. We can give it a prompt, and this is a string that will be displayed below the stimulus. And one of the reasons for this is so that you can remind the participant about any what their task is. So we'll do that. We'll do prompt, and we can say press F. Why don't I'll say F equals non-word, so they know which buttons to press. And I'll say J equals word. And then here we have 2 different options for durations. We have a stimulus duration and a trial duration. So by default, the trial duration is null, which means the trial will sit and last forever until a response is made. Or we can give this a fixed duration, which will essentially put a time limit on the keyboard response. So I'm going to leave this as the default null so that it's going to wait forever for a response. But I could put a separate time limit on the stimulus duration. So this will make the word or non-word disappear after a certain duration. So I'll put that in. So this is stimulus underscore duration, and I'll just make it disappear after 2 seconds. Finally, we have response ends trial. This could be true or false. Now, if we're going to wait forever for a response, then we better make sure that the trial will end. So we should keep that to be true. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it like this. And one thing I should say now is that I'm gonna go for these longer durations because I'm aware that our video quality, because I think recording on Zoom and streaming isn't great. So what might happen is you might miss things that appear and disappear on the screen. So just be aware of that. And I'll try to make these things longer than normal durations so that you can see them. Okay, so we've created our trial. The next thing to do is to add it to the timeline. So we'll do timeline.push, and this is just a way of adding something to the end of an array. So we'll add our word trial. And then we need to actually run the experiment with JSPsych.init on a function. So it needs the parentheses, and then it takes an object. Inside this object, it needs a timeline, which is our timeline array. And then we're also going to add in this onFinish thing that Josh did before. So onFinish, and then you're going to write the word function with parentheses, curly brackets, and then we're going to write in, same as Josh did before, this JSPsych.data.display data. So this will let us look at the data after the task runs. So I think at this point we can save this file and go back to, we can now open it in the browser. So let me find, here we are. So this is the file I've been editing. So if I double click on it, it should open in a browser. Sorry, opened in the wrong one. Let's try that again. Okay, so here's our task. It seems to be working. I'm going to open up the developer tools, which Josh has showed you already, so that I have this console open here. And this is going to be useful so I can just keep an eye out for any errors that might pop up while I'm working on this. So we had a stimulus that showed up, and now we still have this prompt on the screen, and it's waiting for a response. So I'll respond, and now we can see the data. So I can go back to my code now, and let's add a non-word trial. I'm going to copy all of this. And I'm going to change this to non-word. And we can make up a word to put in here, non-word like moxid. And I think apart from that, it's going to be the same. And then let's now add our non-word trial to the timeline. So now we have a word trial, we've added that, a non-word trial, we've added that. So we'll save that and reload our page and just make sure that's working. So we get apple, and then we get moxid, and then we get the data here. So one thing that we can see in the data is we do have a stimulus. So we can figure out whether this is a word or non-word trial by looking at the stimulus. But what would be really nice is if we could add some data in here to categorize these things as being a word or non-word, and we could also save the correct response for each of these. So I'm going to show you how to do that. And to do that, I'll show you in the documentation. So far, we've been looking at the documentation for each plugin separately, and this gives you the specific parameters you have to work with for that plugin. But we can also go here under plugins and overview. And this will give you some more general information about plugins, including the parameters that are available in all plugins. So one of the things we can do is add a post-trial gap. So this will introduce a delay to after the current trial, before the next trial. So that's good for adding an interstimulus interval, and we could also add in some data, and that's what I want to do. So the data has to be an object, and this is going to just store these same key value pairs, so the name and the value for that specific trial. So in my word trial, I'm going to put in here data, and then I need to give it an object. So I could say, I could call it condition, and then the value will be word. And then I could do another one. So by separating with a comma, I can do correct response. And correct response for a word is J. So I'm going to copy this and do the same here for my non-word. And then just change this. So now this will be non-word and the correct response is F. And before we test this, the other thing I want to change is I want to make this font bigger. So one thing we haven't really done yet is talked about adding HTML into the stimulus. So this is an HTML plugin, and we've been using this kind of plain text, but we can also put in some actual HTML here to do a lot, quite a bit of stuff you can do with this. So you could add in all kinds of things like images and audio and whatnot. I'm going to use it with these span tags just to change the formatting of this text. So I'm going to put in the span tag and then write the word style equals. And then in double quotes, I'm going to write font size, colon, and then you could do this in pixels. So I'll do 40 pixels, or you could do a percentage. So if you just Google something like HTML, CSS change font size, you should end up with something that will tell you how to do this. Change the specific things you want to do. You can change the color and all sorts of things like that. So I will copy this span tag here and do the same for my non-word, and then just make sure to close it with that backslash there. So let's go ahead and try this. I will save that and reload my page here. So now my text is bigger, so that's nice. It disappears. I make a response, and the same here. And now the other thing we did was we put this stuff in the data. So my data now contains the correct response for each trial. So in the first trial, it's J, and the second trial is F, and it contains the name of the condition. The next thing I'll do is add a fixation cross. So I'm going to call it fixation. And again, because this is just text that we're putting on the screen, I'm going to use the same plugin. The stimulus is just going to be the plus sign, but I will make it bigger using the same span tag here. So I'll copy that in. Now this time we're using the HTML keyboard response. Let me go back to the plugins here, documentation. So we're using an HTML type because we want to put some text on the screen. The reason we're going with the keyboard response is because that doesn't add anything else to the screen, whereas the button response and the slider will add those things onto the screen. So if you just want to display some text, then this keyboard response is a good one. But in this case, we want to show some text, but we don't actually need to listen for a response, right? So for the key choices, I'm actually going to use this special value here called JSPsych.noKeys. And this will just say that we're not recording any particular response. So it's going to be choices, and then it's JSPsych dot, and then capital no underscore keys. And then the other thing I need to add to this is a trial duration. So how long do we want the fixation to last for? Again, I'll put it on a bit longer so that hopefully it shows up in the video. Now that we've created a fixation, we need to add it onto our timeline. So I'll do timeline.push fixation. And because this line has come first, this is now the first element in the timeline. So it's the first thing in the array. So we'll see a fixation, and then we'll see the word trial. And then I'm going to add this line again by copying it here and pasting down here. So this is going to add our fixation object again, and then it's going to add the non-word trial. Quickly save that and test it by going back here and reloading the page. Fixation cross. Okay, so that's working. So we have something that's starting to resemble a lexical decision task. What I want to do next is add some instructions to the page. So I'm going to kind of start the task with some instructions and then end it with like a thank you message. And then after that, I'm going to come on to what I think is probably the bigger issue, which is how do you add lots of trials in a more efficient way? So we will get to that. But first, I just want to put in some instructions here. So we'll have, I'm going to create an object called instructions. So I'm going to go now into the plugins and have a look in this list here. And you can look through this and you might be thinking or wondering which one to use. And there happens to be one here called instructions. And I think this is a really useful plugin because it allows you to set up a list of different instruction pages, which is often what you want to do, is separate out some instructions onto different pages. And then it also allows the participant to navigate through those pages, either using key presses or using down here this clickable navigation, which is 2 buttons on the screen to move backwards and forwards. So this kind of gives you some nice options for that. So I'm going to use the instructions plugin. And the first thing I'll do is remember to add that, because this is a new plugin for this experiment. I'm going to load that plugin file in at the top. So I've copied my keyboard response plugin, and now I'm going to just replace in here with instructions. So now I can set up my instructions object. This is going to say type instructions. So the plugin name that you're using here is matching this plugin file, but just without that JSPsych prefix. And now I can go back to the documentation to remind myself of what the different parameters are. And there are all these parameters listed here and these all have some default values, but this one called pages says the default is undefined. So this is one that we know we need to specify. So I'm going to write in here pages, and it says it has to be an array. And so each element in the array is the content for a page. So if we want just a single page, we can write that in like this. So we could say welcome, and that would just show a single page. If we want more pages, we just separate those with commas. So this is going to give me 2 pages. I think on the second page, I'll put in the instructions. So something like press the F key, about when you see a non-word, and press the J key when you see a word. Looks like I'm going a little bit fast. I'll try to slow it down a bit here. Okay, so we have our welcome page, and we have some text here. And then I'm also going to write in click the next button to start, just to warn people that when they click next on this instructions, then the task will start. Okay, and now I've defined some instructions pages. The last thing I do want to change here is this clickable nav. I'm going to set this on the default is false, but I do want to show these buttons on the page. So I'm going to do show clickable nav, and I'll set that to true. And another thing actually I've just decided to do is to add a little bit of formatting to this second page here. So we have three sentences in this instructions screen, and I'm going to use some p tags to separate out this text onto different lines. So I'm going to open a p tag before the sentence and close it, and I'll do that for each sentence here. Josh, do we need to stop for any reason, or are we doing okay?
So I had to unmute. I think we're doing okay. There's some requests if we could share code that people could be looking at so they could figure out syntax errors.
Yeah.
And I think that we don't have that available immediately, like right now, because Becky's putting this together live, and it's a little bit different every time we do it. So we will definitely make the code available right at the end of today's session. So if you're getting stuck on a syntax error or something like that, you know, that will definitely help you debug that. It may not be right now because we can't help everybody debug right now, unfortunately. But we will make sure that happens and find ways to get you unstuck.
Okay, thank you. So I'm noticing now I do have a syntax error in my code because I forgot a comma at the end of this long line of pages. Okay, so now I've set up an instructions object. So we've said the type of plugin that we're using is instructions. We've defined some pages. It doesn't matter what you put in here, but if you give yourself two different strings in this array, so you have the square brackets to define an array, and then you can have one string with some text on it, and then a comma and a second string. That will give you two instructions pages. And then we need to, of course, have the square brackets to end the array and a comma. And then I'm using this option that says show clickable nav true. So I've created my instructions object, but I still need to add it to the timeline. So I can again use this timeline.push method. Instructions. And now, because this is the first thing that's been added to the timeline, then this will become the new first thing in my experiment. And then after this, we get the fixation and the rest of it. So I will go ahead and save this file now and just try it out to see if it works. So I'll reload my page in the browser. And we do get our welcome screen. So we get these buttons to go back and forth. If we're on the first page, then the backwards button is disabled, but we can go forwards. And then we see the second page of instructions. But what's nice is then we can go backwards. So you could have several pages and people could, if you want to, they could go back and forth between them. And then it says click the next button to start. So when we do that, we should start seeing our fixation and our words and non-words. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is get rid of this prompt here because now we've put those in the instructions. That's kind of distracting. And I'll also add a post-trial gap. This is a parameter that I mentioned. Just refer back to here. So this is in the overview, and these are parameters available in all plugins. This will just introduce a little delay between the end of the lexical decision trial when I respond and the start of the next trial. So here in my word trial, if I write in here post-trial gap, I could add in some delay in milliseconds, and then that will introduce a delay before the next thing starts. So this is starting to look more like an experiment, but what we need to do now is add in lots of trials, and we need to do that in a more efficient way. So what we're doing right now is creating kind of each trial manually with fixed parameters and then adding that on and doing it for every single thing. So instead of doing that, I'm going to use JSPsych's kind of built-in tool for this. And I should just stop to say that one thing you could do is you could do what Josh did earlier, which is to create a for loop. So you get all your stimuli information, and then you could loop through that information and create your trials that way. So I won't go through that again since Josh already showed how to do that. What I will do is go into this overview section, and then here, this first section called creating an experiment, the timeline does explain a few different ways to add trials onto the timeline. And the one I wanted to tell you about is this timeline variables feature. This is kind of giving you another way to do the same thing. So what we're going to do, we want to repeat the same procedure many times, but using slightly different parameters for each trial. So what I'm going to do then is, I'll go back here. You can see in this procedure object how this works, where we give the procedure a timeline. So this is a procedure that has its own series of events that we want to happen. In this case, a fixation and then an image. So this is going to define the trial procedure that we're looping over. And then we can also give it down here the list of the things that are specific to each trial that we want to change on each trial. So this is essentially what we're going to set up now for our lexical decision experiment. So to do that, what I'm going to do now is remove these lines that say timeline.push for our fixation cross. and for our word trial, and for our non-word trial, because instead we're going to put these things inside of a procedure and add that whole procedure onto the timeline. And the other thing I'm going to do is remove my non-word trial, because instead of creating each trial separately, we're going to create one trial object and just use that for everything. We're going to use it for words and non-words. Okay, so now I have a fixation that I've created and this word trial. And I'll change the name of this to just lexical decision trial, because now sometimes it'll be a word and sometimes a non-word. So we're going to create this procedure object now that needs a timeline, and it needs the timeline variables. So let's call this is a new variable called lexical decision procedure. And like in the documentation, we need something called a timeline, and we also need timeline variables, the things that are going to change across trials. Right, so I've written this in and I've written this in. So the timeline is the array of things that we want to repeat, the array of events. So I'm going to create an array in here with the square brackets. And in this case, I've already created my my trial objects and given them names. So I can just refer to those in here. So I can say fixation, comma, lexical decision trial. And so this is what I'm repeating over in my procedure. And if you had more stuff, you could have one or lots of things or whatever you want in here. Now for timeline variables, this is the array that defines all of the different trials. So each object in this array is going to define the specific information for a single trial. So let's go ahead and create something like that. And I'm going to do that right above my procedure. I'll call this trial info. It's going to be, it's going to be an array. And then inside the array, I need to have an object representing each trial. Are we doing okay?
I think we're good. So there's been one more request about slowing down a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe just going back over sort of the logic of the timeline variables and sort of the rationale would be helpful.
Sure.
And also just to remind the audience that the video will definitely be available for going back through. So if something does go by a little too quickly, we're sorry that that's happening, but also we're hoping that this will be sort of a useful archived resource that people can navigate through at their own pace. And also, of course, we have our Thursday Q&A session from 1 to 5. And that would be another time where we can give you some individualized attention to try to make sure that everything is making sense. But yeah, I think if you could just maybe review the conceptual structure here of what's going on with the timeline variables, that might be helpful.
Absolutely. Sorry for going over this too fast. So let's go back to timeline variables. So the idea here is that we want to more efficiently repeat the same procedure many times. So instead of kind of manually defining one trial and adding that to the main timeline and then adding another one and so on and so on, what we kind of want to do instead is create a more general procedure, which is one or more events that we want to happen. And then we can kind of loop or repeat over those things. So and in here, we can define the things that should be the same on every trial, right? So in this example here in the documentation, there's a fixation cross that always looks the same on every trial. And these parameters are always the same. The duration is always the same and so on. But then what we'd like to be able to do is repeat this whole procedure and just kind of give this a list of things that we want to be different on each trial. So usually that's going to be the stimulus, right? So in this case, we have an image that we're displaying on each trial. And let's say we always want that image to be shown for 2.5 seconds, but on each trial, the actual image we're using is going to change. So JSPsych gives us a way to write it like this, which is kind of a nice way of looking at things. So you can create this general procedure, and then underneath that, you can create this list of things that are variable or specific for each trial. And so that's the idea of just creating it this way. And that's going to prevent you from having to do like trial 1, add that to the timeline, trial 2, and so on. And then what we can do is add this whole procedure onto the timeline. So now instead of adding our fixation 1 and trial 1, we'll create this procedure object, and then this is what will go on the main experiment timeline. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer. And now we can, I think if we go ahead and try it, you might also understand how this works. So again, we have our main experiment timeline here, which is this array. We're still going to be adding our instructions to that directly, right? So we'll just put our instructions on the same as before. But now, instead of adding the fixation to that main timeline and the trial, we're going to put those inside of a procedure, and then we're going to add that procedure. So I'll do that down here. I'll do timeline.push, and then add this procedure onto the timeline. Okay, so I'm hoping that clears things up a little bit. Now what we need to do is create our trial objects. So each object is going to define the information for a single trial, and we're going to give it the things that we want to change on each trial. So we're going to want the stimulus to change, and you can call this whatever you want. I happen to be using the same name as the parameter that we're changing. But it doesn't have to be. So I'll create one that says Apple. Actually, I'm going to copy this whole thing in here so that we get all the formatting. So we'll have a stimulus called Apple. The condition for this trial is word, but this is something that can change across trials. And then the correct response is something that can change across trials. So I'm going to put those 3 things in here. So now I defined a single trial here. And if you wanted other things to change, you could add those in there as well. I'm going to put a comma here and copy that. So I'm going to copy this trial object so that now I have 4 of these inside of my trial array. And then what I'll do is I'll create, the first 2 will be words. So I'll do apple, and I'll change this to something like tree. And then the last 2 trials I'll make into non-words. So we could write moxid or app or whatever non-word you want. And then let's change the condition for these last 2 trials to non-word. And we can change the correct response from J to F. So you should end up with something like this, where you have your array of trial information, where each trial is represented by an object. And then we need the things in here that can change across trials. So the last step here is to tell JSPsych where these different things go inside of our trial procedure. So we've defined a stimulus here, but we need to tell JSPsych where in our trial that should go. And in this case, it goes here in the stimulus parameter. So I'm going to delete this string in our, this is inside our lexical decision trial. Now, instead of giving this a fixed value, we're going to use a function, and that function is called JSPsych.timeline, and then capital V variable. And then we need the parentheses because it's a function. And then now we need to tell JSPsych which thing in our trial object we want to refer to. And in this case, we're referring to the thing called stimulus. So that goes in quotes like that. So now when JSPsych gets to this lexical decision trial, instead of always having the same stimulus, it will go into our trial information and find the thing called stimulus and put it in there. So I'm hoping that makes sense. Let's do the same now for the data. So we have in here, if we leave it like this, then the condition will always be word, but we can replace that with this function. And we'll write in here condition. So now the condition here in the data will be either word or non-word, depending on which trial we're on. Same for the correct response. It's JSPsych.timeline variable. And then we want it we're referring to the thing in the trial data called correct response. Okay, so what we need to do then, I've forgotten to give this trial information to our procedure. So we've now created our lexical decision procedure. We've given it a timeline, which is the things we want to repeat or loop over. So for each trial, we have a fixation and then the trial itself. And then this thing here called timeline variables is this array here containing the information for each trial.
Hey, Becky.
Yes.
There's a question about why do we declare the procedure after we've declared the trials that belong to that procedure, as opposed to saying putting the procedure first and then doing the trials that belong there? Great
question. So this code is all going to run sequentially when we first load the page. So it's going to go through and I think this is right, isn't it, Josh?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay. So it's going to create something called trial information. And if we try to put that in a procedure before we've created it, then we'll probably end up with an error here. So JavaScript won't know what trial info is at this point. So this is why I'm creating everything first. I'm going to create my fixation trial and my lexical decision trial. And I created them there so that I can refer to them down here, create them and then put them in my procedure timeline. And the same with my trial information. As long as I define it somewhere before, then I can refer to it and put it in here. And the other way to do it, which is in the example, I just want to point out this is written slightly differently. These things are defined inside the procedure itself. And that's also fine. You can do it that way. I've just written it in a slightly different way. Okay, let's save this and let's just see if it works now. So we've done we've made quite a few changes here. So always good to check and see if we're getting any errors. So far, so good. We see welcome. Now, hopefully what we'll see is our series of 4 trials. So we should see, yep, apple, tree. I don't know if anyone else can see this. I'll leave it on the screen for a second. Moxid, and our last trial. Okay.
Hey, while you have the data up,
Yeah.
There was a question a while ago about where the response that the participant made is located in the data, because they notice that the correct response, they see J, but they don't see what key the participant pressed.
Yes, great. Okay, so by default for this plugin, the key press is stored as the key code. But there's a direct relationship between the key code, which in this case is 74. This was the key that was pressed on this trial. And you can change that into what you're probably used to, which is the key character, right? And actually, we are going to do that now, I think. Is that all right, Josh? Do you think we have time?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think you have at least 30 minutes.
Okay, great. So let's actually address that now, because we now have the key press for each trial. This is the participant's response stored in the data. And I've stored also the correct response for each trial, which for a word is J. And if we go down here to the non-words, we should see that the condition is non-word and the correct response is F. So what this means is what we could do is actually check the accuracy of the participant's response now, because we have enough information to do that. And we can do that at the end of each trial. So it's only after they've made the response that we can check if it's correct or incorrect. So what I can do is I'm going to add in a function. And I know we haven't talked much about functions, but we are going to talk about them more in the next session. So don't worry too much about what's happening here. But inside my lexical decision trial object, so where we're creating the lexical decision trial, I'm going to add in a parameter called onFinish. And you might notice this is the same or similar to what we wrote down here. We created a function, and this is a function that runs when the whole experiment finishes. And now we're going to do something similar for when each trial finishes. So in my onFinish function, I'm going to write in the word function, and then the parentheses, and inside the parentheses, I'm going to write the word data. And then we have the curly brackets. So we have data here because because this onFinish function automatically gets the data for that trial. It's passed into that function. So this is really useful because it means that after this trial runs, we can have access to the data from this trial. And that means we can check the response and we can add some things into it as well, like the accuracy. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to use this data object to check whether the response that was made matches the correct response for this trial. And then I'm also going to add that back into the data so it's saved along with the rest of the trial data. So I'm going to create a new variable called accuracy. And this is going to store the participant's accuracy, and it's going to be a Boolean, so either true or false. And I'm going to just initialize it as false to start with, and then we're going to change it to true if the response was correct. Now, what we can do is we can write an if statement. So it's the word if and then parentheses, and we can say if data dot, well, I'll do data dot correct response. And then the double equal sign is a comparison, is the same as data dot key press. Then inside of here, what we want to do is change the accuracy to true. Now, this won't work yet because, like this person mentioned, we have a correct response that's stored as a key character, and key press is stored as the key code. But JSPsych gives us a function for converting between these two things. So inside the documentation, I'm going to go into Core Library API, and then at the bottom here, there's this plugin API. And these are functions that are usually used when you're creating plugins, but there are some kind of helper functions that are sometimes useful for these things. So there's one here. It's quite a long function name. I'll just copy it. It's called JSPsych.plugin API, and then the function is called convert key code to key character. So I will do that. This is the key code, the data.keyPress. So this is what I want to convert into a character. So this will, and I'll just go back to my data really quickly here for this experiment. So if we imagine that this is our data for our lexical decision trial, inside of this, we have a key press, which will be the number 74. This function will change that from the number into the character, which will be either F or J. And then we can compare that to what we know is the correct response. And I think I'm probably going to stop here for a second, but the last thing we need to do, we have the accuracy as either true or false. We just need to add that back into the data. So we have this data object, and we can also add new things to it. So I'm going to write in here data.accuracy. And the value of that is going to be this variable. I spelled it wrong, accuracy. Oops. Okay, so this should create a new bit of information in our trial data that will be either true or false, depending on whether the key press was correct or incorrect. I'm just going to run back through it, and this time I'll pay attention to whether my responses are correct or incorrect. So I'll do correct and correct, and then I'll make an error, and then I'll do another error there. So my first two trials, I made a correct response, and now you can see in here my accuracy is true. And in the second trial, that's also the case. And then my third and fourth trials, I made an incorrect response, and we get accuracy false. So it's looking like maybe we need to pause for a second.
Yeah, there's just been a request to maybe pause for a few minutes to let people catch up with anything that they've sort of missed as we've been going.
Yeah.
So we could leave the code. I mean, it's hard to share all of the code at once because
Exactly,
it would be too small to see. But if
and
there are questions, maybe we could pause before we add new code, and we could take 5 minutes to answer any audience questions that might help clarify things that maybe went by that were missed.
Yes, absolutely. It looks like we have plenty of time, so this is a good spot, isn't it, to stop?
Yeah, and we're getting, maybe a suggestion is can we dump this code on maybe like a Google Doc quick that we could share publicly?
Absolutely. I will do that now.
Okay.
And if anyone wants to see a specific part of this file, let me know.
So there's a clarification question, which is, where did we define what the correct response was for a trial? How did we specify that? Maybe what they're asking is on line 33, the line sort of goes off the edge of the screen.
Oh, right.
So maybe it's just a little hard to see, but we could also
separate this out. Sorry about that. So I can write this in multiple lines, which will make it easier. So if what they're asking is how we got the correct response into the trial, then what we did is we use this data parameter, which allows us to add data to a trial. And then we created two things in here, one that saves the condition and one that saves the correct response. And then what we did is we just referred to, instead of using the same value on every trial, we're referring to our data object. Where did that go? Down here. Right, so what this function is doing is saying, instead of using a fixed value, go into our trial information and find the thing called condition. And so on a word trial, that's replaced with a word. And then for the correct response, the value of this is replaced with either F or J.
Great. And the next question that we're getting is, what does line 43 do? Data.accuracy equals accuracy.
Right. So this is a little confusing because they have the same name. But let me just start by explaining what's happening. So we have the data for this trial that we've passed into the function that we're using. So that's stored in an object called data. And you can think of this as being, I'll go back to browser here, something like this. It's an object that has all of the trial information in it. Although at this point, we don't have the accuracy in the trial data. We just have everything else. So what this line is doing is it's taking that object and then it's creating a new key value pair or a new bit of information that we're calling accuracy. And then because we've created a new one, we can also give it a value. And the value is going to be the value of this variable, which is either true or false.
Yeah, and I think something so something that's confusing here is that we can sort of redundantly reuse the name accuracy in two different ways. Maybe it would be clarifying if the variable were ACC for short, and then people could see that there's a distinction between those two things.
I agree, that's confusing. So let's do, we'll change the name of the variable. You can call it whatever you want. So it's just used to store the true or false information of the response. Is the response true or false? Then this line, because there's nothing in the data called accuracy already, I can create that with this data.accuracy. And then once I've done that, I can give that thing a value. So hopefully that part is clear. I'm trying to put the code in a Google Doc and it's not.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm distracting you with questions.
Okay.
Maybe I'll take the next question that I'm seeing, which is somebody's asking, could you briefly go over how to define the parameters of a plugin? Looking at the parameters on the website, I'm not sure what to type for a parameter. Let's see. Becky, I'm going to take over screen sharing for a sec.
Great. Do I need to stop then?
No, I think I can just do it. So we should be back to my screen. I'm going to go back to the documentation. So if you're looking at the documentation for a particular plugin on the website, let's do something that we've been using. So let's use the HTML keyboard response. So the list of parameters is given here. So stimulus, and it gives you some indication of what kind of type of value it's expecting, like an HTML string or an array of key codes. But another really useful thing that's on the website, I think, is that if you scroll down, there's always at least some short example. So you can always go down on any particular plugin page and see at least a minimal example of what a trial might look like. So the type, the different parameter values. And hopefully this gives you sort of a copy pastable thing that you can just put into your code and you can see how it runs and make modifications from there. But if you want to know exactly for a particular parameter what kind of value to put in, that's listed in this type column, and hopefully also the description is clear. Let me also make a pitch here, which is that if you're reading the JSPsych documentation and something's unclear, please let us know. So this documentation is I wrote most of it, but it's really like a community project at this point. My goal is to not be the one writing all the documentation, because probably the person who designed the library is the last person who should be writing documentation for new users of the library. So let us know what's confusing and what's unclear. You can do that in the JSPsych discussion forum that we have a link to on the website. That's also where we'll be hosting our Q&A on Thursday from 1 to 5, that you can ask all the JSPsych questions that you have. And if you have specific suggestions about how to make the documentation better, you can actually edit the documentation or suggest edits to the documentation. And maybe in 2 weeks from now, we'll take a few minutes to just show briefly how that looks if we think that there's time for it. If not, we'll post some resources about how to do that online. Okay, I'm seeing one more question. The data dump includes the HTML formatting for the stimulus. If one wanted to access to just the word for later data analysis, would one put it in another data variable? Becky, do you want to take that, or are you still working on the Google Doc? Okay, she's still working. She's muted and she's still working, I think. I can answer that. I think that the one way to do it, let me pull up some code here, which looks nothing like Becky's lexical decision trial, unfortunately. So maybe this is not the right way to show you. But I would suggest using that data parameter and just sticking the timeline variable in. So you could define the stimulus as one of your timeline variable parameters for each trial. So you'd have stimulus and condition and the correct response. And you could also have word, which is kind of redundant with stimulus. But as this person points out, if you want to have an easier access to data analysis, maybe it makes sense to have the stimulus be the thing with all the HTML characters and have word be a separate thing that you add to the data of each trial. And that would be a way to have the sort of the pure word without the HTML formatting included. Okay, it looks like we have a link to the Google Doc, so we'll get that posted in the YouTube chat. And we, of course, once we're done with this session, we'll be posting another link to the full code. I think there's like 1 or 2 more things that we'd like to show before the session ends. So I'm going to turn things back over to Becky. And we're gonna pause for a minute or two to just, if you want to look at the code in the Google Doc and make some comparisons, we'll let you do that. But we could keep taking questions while people are getting a chance to do that. I think you're muted, Becky.
Sorry, are we back to my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, I did put, yeah, I think we're gonna pause for a second and give people access to the code so far. We're gonna update it again here, like Josh said. The formatting isn't great, so I don't know who can edit it, but if somebody can, but hopefully that at least gives you some references to help. And in fact, it might actually be editable. So if you're looking at it, maybe don't edit it.
Or fix bugs, either one would be good. I don't think you have any. I don't think there are any bugs, but.
Okay, so at least now you can reference that while you're working, and you can kind of scroll through it. So the last thing, I think we've now looked at this and we've decided that it works. So I'm getting a fixation cross. It's going through each trial. that I've defined here in my trial information. And then what we haven't done yet is added an end screen. Maybe I'll do that last. What I want to do next is two things I want to do next. Let's go.
I'm going to jump in really quick. Sorry. I just want to also point out to the audience that, we definitely encourage you to follow along here. And if we've lost you a little bit, again, we're sorry about that. And hopefully what you can do is between now and Thursday, when we have our Q&A, that you'll be able to take a look at the code that we're going to share and that we have shared. You'll be able to rewatch any part of the video that's confusing, and hopefully solidify your understanding. And then, of course, come back to us with questions from 1 to 5. We do have one more question maybe that we could jump on quick.
Yeah, do you want to answer that one?
So the question is, would it also work to use CSS to style the stimulus instead of using HTML to directly edit the style? So I think the question is, could you put the CSS in like a separate CSS file, or maybe even in the style section of the head, which is not something that we've shown here, but maybe you could briefly comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, we could absolutely do that. We were trying to kind of keep things, I don't know if this is simple, but without adding too many different options for people, but you can absolutely do that. So one thing you can do is use the ID information. So the stimulus will have an ID associated with it. And you can add a CSS rule that will change the formatting. And if you do that, then you won't have to write this formatting stuff in every single time. So there are a few ways to do this. And I think what might be better is if we think about either showing people how to do that in the Q&A or doing it in the next session. That's all right?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay, but that's absolutely possible. You don't have to do it like this. And of course, if you didn't want to have to look through this string to get the word, you could add that in here as a separate bit of information. So you could have something in here called item that just says apple. That will make the data a little bit easier to work with. And then just make sure if you do that, that you're also adding it into the data like we did here. So, right. Now, two things that I want to do. One thing you might have noticed is that our trials are always going through in a fixed order. They're going through in the same order that we wrote them in the in that trial array. So one of the nice things about using these timeline variables that JSPsych provides is that it gives us some nice built-in options for things we might want to do with these trials. One of these things is randomizing the order. So we can just, inside of our trial procedure, we can also say randomize order to true. And now each time this procedure runs, this array of trial information will be shuffled around in a different order. In addition, we could do some repetitions. So if we added repetitions into this procedure, like repetitions, and then gave it the value 2, then it would repeat over that trial array twice. And so we end up with 8 trials instead of 4. For now, what I'm going to do in my procedure here, so I've got timeline variables, I'm just going to randomize the order. So I'm going to do randomize _ order and set that to true. And now when I rerun my experiment, I should see that my trials come up in a different order. Just double check that that's worked. It has. Okay, so the last thing that we want to show you here before I think before we take more questions is how to do a feedback screen. Because at this point in our data, in fact, I'll finish running through the experiment so we can see the data. At this point, we have the, for each of our lexical decision trials, we have the accuracy, whether it was true or false. So what this means is we can use that information to display feedback on the screen about the participant's response. So to do that, I need to now create a separate trial object. So I'm going to do this under my lexical decision trial. And I'm going to write in here, call it feedback. And we're just going to display some text on the screen. So again, I'm going to use, for the type, I'm going to use the HTML keyboard response plugin. So just like with the fixation cross, we're going to show some text on the screen, but not worry about listening for a response. And I'm going to leave the stimulus blank for a second. For choices, again, just like the fixation cross, we're going to use this special JSPsych.no keys, because we're not listening for a response in this, we're just showing the text. The last thing we need to do is give it a duration. So we'll do trial duration. So how long do you want to show the feedback for? And I'll put it on for, let's say, 3 seconds. Now, critically, we need to not give the same value on every trial for the stimulus. So for instance, if we wrote in here correct, that would always say correct. Instead of doing that, what we need to do is make it different on each trial, and it has to depend on, of course, on the response. So what we can do here is use a function, and once again, we're going to explain more about this in the next session. But for now, we can just write in the word function with parentheses and then use curly brackets here. And for this function, we need it to return the value that we want for the stimulus. So if we wrote in the word correct, then that would be the stimulus on every trial. And instead of doing that, we're going to create a variable called feedback text. And I am going to initialize it, but just like before, that like how we did with the accuracy, I'm going to give it a value, and then I'm going to change that value depending on the response accuracy. And then I'm going to return feedback text. So what we need to do in here is change the value to correct if the response was correct. So what we have to do now is go into the JSPsych data from the last trial and try to pull out this accuracy thing that we saved here. So for this, I'm going to refer you to our documentation. And this is inside the core library API. There's a section on working with the data. So we're going to go in here to jspsych.data. And there's lots of functions here for both accessing the data and doing lots of different things with it. But there's something specifically that will be useful for us, which is this function called jspsych.data, and it's called .getLastTrialData. So whatever the last thing was on the timeline, it will give us that data. So I'm going to copy that. And I think I'm going to create a new variable here called last trial accuracy, because what I'm going to do is get this data and then try to get the accuracy out of it. So we'll start with this function. This will give us the data from the last trial, which is our, this feedback is going to go after the lexical decision. So this will, the last trial will be a lexical decision trial. And then what we need to do is go back here and say, look at what this returns. This gives us a data collection object. And you probably don't know what that is. So let's scroll down to this data collection section here. So a data collection is one or more, the data for one or more trials in the experiment. And what you have here are a whole set of different useful methods for doing lots of things with it. So you can count the number of things in it, you can convert it to CSV and JSON format and do all kinds of things. But in our case, we just want to get the values. We just want to get the actual content, right? So I'm going to use this .values function at the end. And I know I'm going a bit fast, but I think we can answer questions about this later if necessary. So this is getting the last trial data. Then we're going to do .values to get the values from that. This values function returns an array. So what we're actually trying to get at is the data for just the last trial, which looks like this. But this is stored inside of an array. So to get it out, we need to index that array with square brackets and then just grab the first thing in the array, which happens to be the only thing, which is the data from the last trial. Finally, we're now at this point where we have this data object. So now we could access any of the information from this trial that we want to, like the key press and the condition. But what we really want is the accuracy. So we can write in dot accuracy. So all of this together will give us the accuracy from the last lexical decision trial. So then what we can do is write an if statement and say if last trial accuracy, and that's true or false. So you could leave it, or you could write true to be more explicit. So if the accuracy of the last trial was true, then we want to change this feedback text. Right now it's incorrect, but we can now change it to correct. Okay. I think that's it. So let's just, no, it's not it. We've created our feedback trial. We now need to add it to our procedure. So let's do that too. So now, instead of just looping over the fixation and the lexical decision trial, we also want to show this feedback. Oops. Sorry, there we go. Just write in feedback. This feedback trial after every trial. Okay, so let's just test that now and see if it works. Save, go back to my browser and reload the page. And hopefully we see a correct or incorrect after each trial. So this one, we don't. Oh, we do. I put in the delay. Okay, so we'll get that one correct and then we'll see the word correct. Let's get one wrong. So we'll do, I'll say that's a word and it says incorrect. Okay, so I think we're going to stop and take questions. The only other thing, because this would be nice, is to put in some formatting here. So if we again use these span tags, we can change the color and the size. So you could do span and then inside of this style equals, and then do the larger font size like we did before. Sorry, let's change this to single quotes so that I can use double quotes on the inside. So span, style, and then inside of this, we can change the font size again to something bigger, like 30 pixels, and we can change the color to red. And we can do the same for this one, and let's close the span tag here. Okay, so I've just added in some formatting to change the size and color of my correct and incorrect feedback text. And if I'm just going to check that it works, and then we can stop and post the code. That should be incorrect. Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to hand back now. I think we have questions and other things to get to.
Great, thanks so much.
Yeah.
So just a couple immediate questions based on what you were doing. So one is kind of just a foundational thing that we forgot to talk about, which is semicolons and JavaScript and commas. So why do some lines end with a semicolon and other lines end with a comma? Maybe I'll take it. Sorry. So yeah, sorry, I was posing it to you, but I'll do it. In JavaScript, a semicolon is the end of a statement. So if you look at line 50 here that's on screen, the line 50 says that there's a variable called feedback text, and that's equal to this bit of HTML. And then that's the end of that statement, so there can be a semicolon. Now, the weird thing about JavaScript is that actually semicolons are optional. So you can use them or you can just ignore them. And that may be confusing because, for example, on line 55, there's a statement, return feedback text, but that doesn't have a semicolon. And I'm not trying to pick on you, Becky. I do this all the time. Like I have semicolons somewhere and I don't know why sometimes I feel the need and why sometimes I don't have the need to put a semicolon. So the difference between a semicolon and a comma is that the comma is sort of continuing the construction of an object or an array. So if we go down a little bit to line 62, we can see here that we're building an array. So this statement really starts on line 61, where we're constructing this trial info array that's going to have all of the parameters for each of our trials. And then at the end of line 62, we have a comma because we want to add more things onto this array. So you can think of line 61 through 66 as a single statement that's constructing an array, but we're separating out the items in each array. And that's why we have a comma at the end of the line for 62, 63, and 64. So hopefully that's clarifying the comma semicolon distinction.
Right. And I think also the fact that these are on different lines is just to make it more readable. You could put this all on the same line. So maybe that's confusing as well.
Yep. Yeah, JavaScript doesn't care about white space or line spacing or things like that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So just quickly before we keep answering more questions, I just want to highlight one resource and also remind people about where to go for the Q&A on Thursday. So the Q&A on Thursday will have links on our website, movingresearchonline.info. That Q&A is going to happen in 2 places simultaneously. So we'll have some questions that are generic questions about online experiments. That'll be on our Google Groups forum for online experiments. And there you can go to ask about questions like, are reaction times any good online? Is that something that we can measure reliably online? And it turns out there's been a lot of work on this, and people have been doing some very careful science about this. So we have a pretty good idea about what the answers to that question, but we could answer that generally in the online discussions forum, online experiments discussion forum. The other place where we'll be hosting Q&A is at the JSPsych discussion forum. So you can get to that through the link again that we'll post on our website. It's also part of the JSPsych GitHub page. If you're already familiar with that, there's a tab for discussions at the top. And there you should feel free to post any questions that you have about JSPsych. They can be absolute beginner questions. It's a really, it's a great community of users. There's lots of people who will jump in, including, of course, Becky and myself, and try to help answer questions on Thursday. So that's 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday. Everybody from the workshop team will be trying to answer questions during that moment. And of course, you can post questions before 1 o'clock on Thursday, and they may get answered before 1 o'clock on Thursday. You can use those forms anytime you'd like, but we'll try to have a concerted effort to answer questions rapidly on Thursday. The other resource that I want to highlight quick, and maybe I'm going to take over the screen again for a moment. So the other resource that I want to share, oh, I lost my browser window. Here we go, is that if you go to the JSPsych documentation, there are 2 tutorials on the documentation page. So the first one is kind of covering what I talked about. It's a little bit simpler than what I talked about. It just gets through the basics of creating a simple hello world kind of message on the screen. But it does review how to set up a folder and where to put things and how to get a text editor and all that stuff that you might need to do still. The second tutorial is much longer. This covers a lot of the stuff that we talked about, and it covers actually more than we talked about today. But it's a text-based format. So if you feel like reviewing stuff with a different explanation and through a text-based system instead of a video-based system might be helpful, there's a lengthy tutorial here that covers everything we talked about, including timeline variables and feedback and all of those things. So you should be able to access that as another learning resource between now and Thursday if you have questions. And then finally, before we start answering some of the questions in the queue here, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a session on more advanced features of JSPsych. And in this session, we're going to try to explain a little bit more about sort of how the code that you're writing on the screen gets translated into the timeline that JSPsych is running, which might help understand better why we need to use functions when we're doing feedback, or why certain things have to be declared in a certain order. So why do we have parameters for a trial before that trial appears in a procedure or something like that? So we will be talking more about advanced features like different kinds of feedback that you might give, and other things that are more sort of dynamic and responsive to the user. And we'll talk about sampling from different kinds of variables and things like that. So definitely come back on Thursday from 1 to 3:30 in 2 weeks. And of course, next Thursday from 1 to 3:30 will be our discussion that's not about any tools at all, at least not directly. It's more about just doing online research in general and advice and best practices for doing that. Okay, let me see what's in the question.
Can I jump in and just say too, I think in the advanced section, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about modifying plugins. And so if you decide that, you look through the list of plugins, I know Josh has mentioned this already, and there's nothing that does exactly what you need. I think one of the great features about JSPsych is you can go in and make it do exactly what you want it to. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing I want to quickly say is I'm going to update the Google Doc with the most recent version of my lexical decision that includes that feedback. So I just want to warn people that it's going to change. Okay. All right.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I think we'll also post a non-Google Doc version of the code once we have a little bit more time to manage that. We'll post it in a folder where you can download the code and the library all together, so that you can just open it and run it, and then you can compare it with whatever you were writing during the live part of the workshop. So we have 15 more minutes here that we're planning to be available. So we have a couple questions, but if there are any questions that people would like, especially anything that's pretty generic or general about the conceptual questions about the library, this would be a great time for us to take those. And then, of course, we can get to more specific details in the Q&A session on Thursday. So let's see. So one question here is, could we repeat the explanation for the accessing the data from the last trial that we did when we were showing the feedback? Becky, could you handle that? Because I can't.
Absolutely. Sorry, I was muted. Let me go back to my screen then.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm not seeing how to do it.
Oh, maybe here, I'll stop sharing. Can you share?
Yes. Okay, sorry about that. Can you see my text editor?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. So the question is about this line here, and this is a bit confusing, this line. So what's happening is that, first of all, we need to use a JSPsych function to get all of the data that's been stored so far in the experiment. And I did show you, and I can show you again, where the documentation is for this. Here we go. Let's see here. It's in this JSPsych.data section. So if you want to grab all of the data that JSPsych has collected at a certain point in the experiment, you can use like the JSPsych.data.get function. But we're using one, there's some different options for doing this, and there's one specifically for getting the data from the last trial. So that's the function that we're going to call first.
Can I jump in really quick here?
Yes.
Also in the overview section. So the overview section of the documentation is more like narrative documentation, and the core library API section is more sort of reference material. So if you go to, the page that Becky's pulled up here, the data storage, aggregation, and manipulation, this is more of a narrative description of how to interact with data. And it contains some examples for how to do things like what we're doing in the experiment here. It also talks about some other stuff like data storage and things that we haven't touched on yet.
Sorry, yeah, this is definitely what I should be using. So in this example, you might want to get all of the data and then filter all of the trials, and you can do that here. So in the documentation for data collection, what I wanted to show you is that you get all these kind of special tools that JSPsych has created for you to use to do these things. So you can have a filter function and all sorts of things you can do. You can get the last N trials from your data collection. But the reason we need to use that values function is because we're not doing one of these special things. We're actually just trying to get at the data itself inside of this from the last trial. Now, the other somewhat confusing thing about it, I think, is if we go into the Get the last trial data. It says it returns a data collection. And then we went down here into data collection, and then we get the values. So this always returns an array. Now, in our case, because we want the data from the last trial, we know it's only going to be one thing. But instead of giving us that data itself, it's giving us an array that contains that data. So that's why in our, go back here, so that's what the values is giving us, is an array that contains the data. So you can imagine we have something that is an array that looks like that, and then an object inside with some data in it. So to get this object out, we need to index the array. And in our case, we want, JavaScript is indexing starts at 0. So 0 is the first element in the array. And in our case, there's always only going to be one thing in it. But in any case, we want to get the first thing in it, which is the data object. And once we have that, we're now working with the trial data that I showed you before. I don't know if I still have it. Pull it up. But it's the data that you see at the end of the task. So at that point, this is what we have to work with. And so now what we can do is grab the value of accuracy. And I hope that clears things up.
So I think a related question here, and this is something that we'll be getting to more on in 2 weeks when we talk more about sort of functions and advanced features of the library. But maybe we can quickly try to answer, why can't we just use the accuracy variable that we defined just above as the method for presenting feedback?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. If you scroll up a little bit, I can try to answer that. I just want to maybe be able to show that specifically. So could we see the, yeah, okay. So at the end of the previous trial, we created this accuracy variable that defines whether the user, the participant got the question correct or incorrect, was the lexical decision trial. So one thing that you might be wondering, which this audience member was asking, is, well, we've got this variable right here. Can't we just use it when we do the feedback trial? Why do we need to go through this trouble? And maybe the short version of this answer is that variable only exists inside that function that we created. So we run this function, this set of steps at the end of every trial, every lexical decision trial. And as we're running that function, we're computing accuracy for that trial. And then the line that Becky has highlighted is adding the computation of accuracy onto the data object for the trial, so that that data exists inside JSPsych's data structure. By the time we get down to the next feedback trial, that variable no longer exists. So that variable doesn't exist in that scope. So we can't reference it. It's just not available. We could do some things like have a global variable, and we could reference that global variable, and that would work. But it might lead to messier code that is initially maybe a little easier to understand, but is easier to make mistakes with too. So this is probably adding it onto the data and then accessing the data directly is probably the logical way to do things. And again, I think in the session in 2 weeks, we'll talk more about why does stimulus have to be a function at all when we do the feedback? Why can't we just have like an if statement that says, if accuracy is true, then show the correct, and if it's not, show an incorrect. And we'll talk about the logic and the structure of that in 2 weeks. And I think the tutorial on the website also helps explain that logic a little bit. Okay, the next question we're getting is one that you anticipated, Becky. So a bunch of people have asked whether it's possible to read in stimuli from an external file like a CSV, or whether they have to be defined individually. So yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so, well, I don't know if your recommendations are the same as mine, Josh.
Well, we can give different recommendations. That's fine.
So what I often do is okay, the short answer is you can't just read in a CSV file, I think. I hope that's the right answer.
I think that's right.
Okay.
I know of, yeah.
I'm not aware of a way to do that. So what you can do is you can, if your data is stored in a CSV format, and let me show you an example. I might have an example somewhere here. You can use an online converter to convert a some CSV formatted text into JSON formatted text. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and this is a text format. So it's still text rather than JavaScript, but it's very, very similar to this structure that we see a lot of in JavaScript. And in fact, the data that we see at the end of the experiment is JSON. So it's that, it looks a lot like JavaScript. So if you want to, you could convert your CSV file of trial information into JSON format. And then what you'd have is something that's very similar to what we wrote in here. Let me find our trial information here. So you'd end up with something very similar to this. But you'd have one more step, which is to convert it from JSON into JavaScript. So
no, I think that's exactly how I do it too. So we agree. So in that last step of converting the JSON into JavaScript is merely just adding the keyword for the variable in front of it. The array bracket, everything after that equal sign, that's actually valid JSON pretty much right there. It would be, I think you'd have to add quotes around the stimulus and condition and things like that. But otherwise, this counts as JSON. So you can take a spreadsheet and convert it to what this looks like right here, and then just load that JSON file as a JavaScript file right into your experiment. So that's a pretty simple solution.
Yeah, so what Josh is suggesting is that I'll even just show you here. So you can create a new file if you want to, and then you would, so you could convert your CSV formatted information into JSON, and then that would look like this, sort of. Back here, something like that. And then what you can do is just give it a variable name. So we use this trial info equals. And if you save this as a JavaScript file, you could then load it here with all of your other JavaScript files, and then you'd have access to that variable. Or if you want to, you could just copy this whole thing, right? And you could put it right in your script. So,
yep.
Yeah, okay.
Somebody's asking if we could recommend a CSV to JSON converter. I don't know off the top of my head. I always just Google it and usually choose like the first one that doesn't look like a spam page.
Exactly what
But you know, if we can investigate, and we could post a link on our website if people would like a stronger recommendation than that. Okay. On another note, how do I make sure that the participant can continue the task if he reloads the page? Is this even possible? So that's a great question, and the short answer is that if you're doing things with just JSPsych, this is not possible. Once a participant reloads the page, they will start from scratch because the JSPsych code will reload. You can do things in JSPsych that will like pop up a warning message if somebody's about to navigate away from the page. So you could say, "Are you sure that you want to leave the experiment?" And they would have to click OK just to make sure that that's something that they wanted to do. And you can even do things in JSPsych, like if somebody's leaving the experiment unexpectedly, you can quickly capture all their data and save it to your server. Yeah, that's what Becky's showing here. Is there's this onClose method, and this is called when somebody leaves the experiment. If you wanted to get fancier, then you could, in theory, you could have JSPsych check with your server, that other piece of an online experiment that we're not really talking about today, but we'll talk about in week 4 of this workshop. You could have your experiment communicate with a server, and that server could check if this particular participant has already started the experiment. And if so, it would take some work to do. This would not be a trivial thing, so I don't want to make it sound easy. But you could, in theory, resume the experiment where they left off. But it would not be an easy thing to set up, at least not with the way things currently are. But that just gives me a chance to say that JSPsych is a community developed project. We are eager for people who are ready to contribute to the site. And that could include as simple as just editing documentation, but it could also include much more complex things like writing new features for us that allow people to resume their session by using like local storage on the browser, which I think we could do, but would take a lot of work to get done. So please help us out. The more of us that are working on this as a platform, the stronger it will be for everybody. So hopefully that's inspiring to at least one of you. That'll be my goal. Okay, I think we have about one more question to handle that I can see in the queue. So why is it, so this is going back to that accessing data, and I'll take responsibility for this because I wrote the names of the functions, but why is it necessary to index the 0 to get the data from the last trial if we've already specified that we want to get data from the last trial with the function we use? Yeah, that's on me because that's just like bad API design on my part, I think. The reason is that get last trial returns this thing called a data collection, and Becky was talking about this. And a data collection is designed to give you data from an arbitrary set of trials. So even if you have only one trial, it's returning to you a kind of object that's meant to hold data from 1 to every trial in your experiment. And so in order to make that, in order to make the programming functions generic, you do have to do kind of weird things like this, where you sort of specify that you want one trial, but then you still have to pull it out of the array. And that's something that maybe, as Becky was going through this, I was thinking in my head, like, oh, I should have designed a better API for this. So maybe that's something that we'll look at as we release the next version of JSPsych, is making this a little bit more intuitive for people. Okay, it's a little after 3:30 now. So just one last reminder for our Q&A session on Thursday. I don't see any more questions right now that I've been made aware of yet. So if you have questions that haven't gotten answered, please bring those to the Q&A session on Thursday and check the website for that information. And thanks so much for attending our first session, and hopefully we'll see a bunch of you in a week, and also, of course, on Thursday. So take care, everybody.